Over 25 years ago, Nelson Mandela walked out of a prison in Cape Town, a free man for the first time in 27 years. 2 years later, a referendum held exclusively among South African whites supported the abolition of apartheid by 69% of the vote. The Cape Times, newspaper of white liberals, trumpeted its yes on its front page. In the general election 2 years later, the formerly banned African National Congress won by a landslide. An era of savage, racist oppression came to an end. Or did it? A quarter of a century on, the country is in deep trouble. 3 years ago, South Africa experienced its worst police killing since the Sharpeville massacre, when Marikana miners were slaughtered by cops. This year, there's been a crescendo of racist violence against migrant workers. And as the government of Jacob Zuma attempted to raise tuition fees for new students, a mass anti-fees movement hit the streets. When reporting on South Africa's problems, those other than the ones pertaining to the sports star and spouse killer Oscar Pistorius, it is customary for the Anglophone media to make some genuflecting reference to Mandela's dream. Al Jazeera, Fox and Bloomberg, to name a few. How could it have gone awry? In fact, as we'll see, the question is, whose dream was it, and whose interests did it serve? In October, South Africa was hit by a student movement of a scale that it had not seen since apartheid. While some media outlets, such as the Washington Post, were more concerned with mainstream media becoming old in South Africa and drooling about the role of Twitter in the uprising than in explaining its context, South African media, such as the nation's Sunday Times, were more concerned to censure the culture of violence allegedly informing the protests. For ordinary South Africans, however, the so-called born-free generation are not happy, as the BBC reports. Why? Because the nation's wealth is still hoarded by a white minority. The BBC quotes Panashe Chigamadzi saying, "South Africa is a cappuccino society, a vast, huge black majority at the bottom with a layer of white cream and a few chocolate sprinklings at the top of it." This disparity in wealth is compounded by the lack of educational access. Notably, the BBC is curiously indeterminate about this obvious fact. Its article, "Why Are South African Students Protesting?" reports, "Many black students say they come from poor families and fee increases will rob them of the opportunity to continue studying." This is a television station whose political editors appear to be able to read the precise, usually benign, intentions of Downing Street, but they can't do sufficient research to work out for themselves whether many black students in South Africa come from poor families. This caution is doubly curious since, as another BBC article about South Africa's student revolts points out, it is just a matter of fact that one of the major aspects of the apartheid system was the Bantu Education Act of 1953, which prevented black children from getting a complete education. Other outlets are in less doubt. As Nikki Falkhoff writes about the student revolts for the New York Times, neither universities nor the government are doing nearly enough to help poor, which generally means black students, survive and graduate. The original impetus for the protests was a proposed 10.5% fee increase that would have locked some students out for life. A 10,000 Rand upfront fee, about $750, would have prevented many existing students from registering and caused them to lose access to whatever funding or scholarships they had. This is the fundamental issue which led in October to the emergence of a mass student movement against increased tuition fees. As Al Jazeera reports, in just over a week, a handful of students managed to mobilize the country into a nationwide movement which became known as #FeesMustFall. The issue of tuition fees gets to the root of the problems facing young black South Africans, but it is also linked to a growing pattern of workers' militancy. As the Financial Times reports with some concern, industrial unrest is giving jitters to the mining companies that dominate South Africa's economy. The breach giving rise to the breakdown of the post-apartheid establishment was signalled over 3 years ago in August 2012 when South African police killed 34 striking workers at a mine owned by the Lonmin Company. The company was part owned by Vice President Cyril Ramaphosa, also sole owner of McDonald's South Africa and the favourite to succeed current President Jacob Zuma. Here was a meat exemplar of anti-democratic, violent state capitalist collusion in which the interests of a rich few came before the rights of workers. A major study of the South African media's coverage of this massacre was published in the country's Mail and Guardian, How South African Journalism Failed the Test. It found that journalists typically engaged in what it called embedded reporting and sensationalism, refusing to publish the perspectives of the striking miners or anyone with a view other than that of the authorities. The sympathies of some of the international media in this are perhaps best illustrated by the glowing piece written by former executive editor Bill Keller for the New York Times on Cyril Ramaphosa, the best leader South Africa has not yet had. Ramaphosa played a key role in orchestrating the government's crackdown on the Marikana miners, and despite the litany of documentary evidence implicating him in the escalation of the repression, a judge this year let him off the hook. The Guardian reported that the Marikana massacre is a tale of utter shame for South Africa. Over 1,000 days since the deaths of 34 people, not a single person is being held accountable. There is no justice or closure for a single life lost or family destroyed. But in addition to renewed protest and militancy, there are also more ominous signs from South Africa, where escalating racism is directed against migrant workers. This reached a bloody crescendo earlier this year when, in April, bands of South Africans gathered to attack foreigners whom they blamed for high unemployment. The Christian Science Monitor reported that anti-immigrant violence had spread to South Africa's largest city, with crowds carrying machetes and attacking Somalis, Ethiopians and Pakistanis from Durban to Johannesburg. The Guardian, reporting on a recent pogrom and South Africa's failure to stem the racial tension, explained, "It started as these things so often do, with a rumour. An Arab man with a beard was said to be responsible for a string of murders and mutilations in Grahamstown in the Eastern Cape. It ended with violence and fire and destruction, and an unmistakable message to foreigners: you are no longer welcome here." There is little sense given of how structural this racism is in South African societies. One of the underpinnings of South Africa's segregated labour system was always the system of migrant labour. From the first appearance of British mining capital, exploiting precious metal, mineral and diamond resources, the entire labour system depended upon importing black workers from rural areas and subjecting them to lower wages and more menial work. As the system developed, the rich, white economic core of apartheid South Africa sucked in millions of labourers, not just from the segregated homelands where the black majority lived, but also from surrounding countries. The legacy of that period is an entire political economy that is dependent on racial stratification and competition between the poorest for a few crumbs from the table of the rich, and still overwhelmingly white. What is the reason for South Africa's woes under the ANC? Even the conservative Financial Times journalist Martin Wolf acknowledges that today, pre-tax inequality is as high as 20 years ago. But he also claims that the problem now is that the redistributive policies of the early democratic period are exhausted, and that the solution was to let the poorer parts of the country develop with lower wages. The Economist takes a similar approach, blaming the country's problems on the government's failure to implement a market-friendly development plan. The New York Times takes a similar approach, publishing an op-ed from a World Bank apparatchik who blames the situation on strong unions and regulations. A harder and more racist variant of this neoliberal argument comes from the formerly anti-apartheid South African writer R.W. Johnson, who, having previously compared migrants in South Africa to baboons, explains in an interview with BizNews that the period of black majority rule has been one long spiral of failure. The big truth is that since 1994, the ANC has relied upon the inherited infrastructure from white rule. Roads, airports, electricity supply, water, the whole thing. They've gradually been running it down by failing to do maintenance and so forth. Johnson argues that the ANC has failed to do what its white forebears did and attract foreign capital. He looks forward to it being forced to seek an IMF bailout and implement neoliberal structural reforms to tempt capital back into the country. Could it be, however, that the problem is precisely the reverse of what most of the Anglophone media suggests? The author and academic Patrick Bond describes South Africa's post-apartheid change as an elite transition, which was carefully managed by the establishment that had benefited from apartheid. In a review of the Mandela Years of Power, written after his death, Bond wrote for the radical publication Counterpunch that Mandela fit into a pattern of formerly anti-authoritarian critics of old dictatorships, whether from right-wing or left-wing backgrounds, who transformed into 1980s, 1990s neoliberal rulers. Using the language of international competitiveness, Mandela used his immense reputation to ensure an intra-elite economic deal that for most people worsened poverty, unemployment, inequality and ecological degradation. Another result was the enrichment of a smattering of former radical leaders of the ANC, such as Ramaphosa, whose access to governmental power also gave them access to industrial power. John Campbell writes at the Council on Foreign Relations that this process was lauded by Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki as the creation of a patriotic bourgeoisie necessary to the empowerment of black South Africans, even though the black majority remains as poor as ever. As the Cameroonian writer Akili Mbembe puts it, the key question that was never satisfactorily answered in the transition and is now driving a new wave of student and union militancy is who owns South Africa?